So we at this moment perfectly in the middle of our journey, the 24-hour journey around the world. And I'm very glad to introduce to you our next guests. My name is Francesca Piredda. I'm Associate Professor at the Design Department, Politecnico di Milano, and our guests right now are Virginia Tassinari and Nick Baerten. Welcome, my friends.
Good evening, Francesca. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you for being here. Virginia is from, they are calling us from Belgium, and Virginia is from Lucca School of Arts. She is also educator and researcher in design and philosophy at Politecnico di Milano. And we had, I feel so lucky to have had the opportunity to reflect together many times around the urgency of building new narratives around design and design for social innovation. And also Nick, welcome as well. Nick is a co-founder of Pantopicon, a foresight studio and design studio based in Antwerp in Belgium. So I'm so happy that we have the chance to be together here tonight. Thank you again. And
happy and honored. Thank you
for the invitation.
And well, as you know, and also our audience knows, this event, this project, has the main goal to build together reflections and a new glossary for the changes in design after pandemic. So we ask to you, just like to all the other guests, to provide a special word for enriching this discussion. And you suggested to talk about and reflect about the term neurological. And I think it is really, really interesting and highlighting talking about this word because, of course, provides us the opportunity of reflecting upon the idea of finding maybe new words for discussing about the ongoing situation and about our futures, maybe, as designers, first of all, of course. I would like to start with a question at first to Virginia, just because of a gender issue, maybe. So, Virginia, do we have enough words to describe the world we live in today? Is our lexicon still meaningful today?
Wow, what a question, Francesca. I think it's never enough. I mean, the words we have are never enough to really describe what reality is. It's always a kind of an approximation. And of course, we have to be sometimes to be just content of the how much we can get closer to reality as we can. So knowing that it's impossible really to grasp what is out there. We cannot really describe what reality is, but we can try to rephrase it in many different ways. And I think that's also probably why in the last years I've been working a lot on dictionaries and lexicons and trying to question the words we use in design and to reframe them. And what I'm realizing, I think probably this has also to do with the times we are living, is that I need much more than before to rephrase also the words I use and even to come back to the lexicons of the dictionaries I've been working at in the past year and see which are the meanings right now. And at this moment, I'm working together with my colleagues from Politecnico, and particularly with Davide Fassi at the Situated Dictionary. So really like trying to look at the meanings within a neighborhood of Milano called Nolo, to look at how people living the neighborhood look at different meanings that are important for the neighborhood. For instance, common issues or common place and so on. And what we see is that we need to rephrase it again, even if we did it a few months ago, because the situation now changed a lot, the perception of people and how we intend certain words. And I remember that just before the pandemic crisis arose, we had this philosophy talk in February in which we were talking about the new normal, meaning something totally different as we mean by the word new normal now. So I think we are in a time in which it's becoming even more clear that meanings are always shifting, but this was always the case. It's just that I think the velocity, I mean, how fast this goes now, it's really just astonishing for all of us, I think.
Yeah, you're right. So, talking about changes, Nick, how can we, as designers, create new meanings and deal with the processes of change?
That's a very deep question. I'm not sure we have enough time to discuss all angles of it, but I think there's quite a bit of discovering that needs to, or rediscovery that needs to take place, an awareness that needs to grow about the condition we're in, but also, as Virginia mentioned, the terms that we use in order to describe it, the way we relate to it, the way we try to phrase it in order to make others understand how we interpret it, etc. And so there's a mutual fascination for the role of language in that, which is also one of the reasons why we picked the word neological, which stems actually from a design fiction performance that we set up a few years ago, in which we felt like going through so many scenario building exercises with clients in our foresight work, that so much emphasis is placed on the visual when it comes to imagining what the future world might look like. Even the very terms looking, image, imagining, all those dimensions, they refer to the visual spectrum, and which made us actually question that situation in a more critical way and say, like, wait a minute, there's a whole dimension that remains unexplored when we're dealing with language. Yet there's also so much potential of language as an instrument that we use in order to not just to communicate, but also to understand and to make things understandable. And so in the Neurological Institute, we took that into a more speculative realm almost, in which we said, what if there were an institute in this world which would have as its sole purpose to come up with new words, hence the term Neurological Institute, as in neologism, but also new words to come up with that might inspire new worlds, or that might inspire new logic, new ways of thinking. So how could we turn language or rediscover that instrument side of language again? And so what we did is actually we deconstructed and recombined and reconstructed words. So the image of the word came before the meaning of the word. So it wasn't like we were looking, although we were very aware at that time that there was this notion that a lot of the language that we're using does no longer cover the terrain that we want to use it for. So there's plenty of dimensions that we seem to be having a very hard time with as a society, to explore the full dimensions of the meanings of a word, because they've become so overloaded with meaning in the past that, of course, you want to express new things, or you want to re-envision or reassess a meaning because the context has changed. But we weren't as much looking for new words for things that we felt like needed something. We were much more looking at the generative power of language. And so in that sense, it was kind of like also a wake-up call, I guess, to many people in the design world, like, wait a minute, instead of just focusing on the tangible in terms of focusing on the visual, on audio, there's something in language as a generative force. How one word can actually open up a completely different world, a completely different logic, to rediscover that as well. So in terms of coming up with or envisioning new worlds, I would say a language is a good place to start, but one angle of the universe that we tend to have forgotten a little bit, at least in this profession.
That's fine, because it reminds me to the word Imagineering. And so maybe we could think about wordeering or something like this. And so looking at our contemporary society and the many changes that we have to face in terms of new technologies, in terms of the creating the space and the place for dealing with the different domains in relationship with human being and other kinds of beings in that world or in the system we live in. I'm thinking about this idea that maybe the generative power of language, thinking about the human being as for certain motherhood in humans. But then we could also have algorithms or other kind of technologies that could be generative as well, in terms of building and reframing and rebuilding the little pieces of the words we are using. So how can we deal and how can we manage this kind of generative processes?
I think, yes, indeed, we're waking up to an era in which there will be a lot more actors involved. Some of the actors that we ourselves have created when we're talking about artificial intelligence, when we're talking about synthetic biology. There's plenty of domains in which we as humans have moved from an era in which we studied nature and we studied certain mechanisms and certain organisms. And we've entered this era now in which we start not just manipulating their building bricks, but actually creating them from scratch. And that leads to a completely different model of agency in which we find ourselves. And obviously, I think that's a very interesting area in terms of to explore. Also in terms of how, not just how we might describe them or how we might find new wordings or new language to deal with them, but also which new languages might arise because of them. So I think there's a very much an open door that's opening, and we don't yet know what's behind it completely. But I would say that now is the time to grow or to flex our muscles when it comes to coming up with enough of nuance. I would say rediscover the nuances in not just language, but in everything that we do, in order to be able to position well what's going on in those areas. And I think it feels sometimes now that we're still using a lot of mind frames that stem from the mechanical or the mechanistic era, while we're entering the biological or the organic era, in which a lot of those clean cut separations and descriptions of things, those black and white without any shades of gray in between kind of things, were considered as a way forward out of the mess, a way forward into a deeper understanding. And of course, there's tremendous value in that approach. But I think right now what we need most is nuance and a new sense of sensitivity or sensibility.
It's also, I think, a matter of other points of view, like who is empowered to define what reality is. And of course, we take it for granted, but we look at things in a very anthropocentric way. And I think this is something, sort of awareness that we are really getting, I think, within the design world, that we shouldn't do that we should really get outside of this very anthropocentric way of looking at the world around us and feeling that we are really part of it, and feeling that we are not entitled to define what it is, because it defines us the way we are. And it's just a dialogue, it's just a relationship that we just should learn to acknowledge. And probably there are other uses of languages also outside the Western context that are more able to capture those nuances, and how my identity is really in the relationship with what is around me, and I cannot just define myself as a subject and looking at things as objects of my work. And I think this kind of awareness is something that we need to learn, both from self-critiquing our way of looking at things, but also by looking at other ways of looking at things. And we had like last week a philosophy talk in which we had Marisol de la Cadena, and she was explaining how the identity, for instance, in the indigenous culture she was studying, like the identity of human was defined by the relationship with a mountain. And I was thinking how powerful this is for design, and how little, like how ignorant we are of these other ways of wording, and how they relate to the way we use language and we understand language. So I think there's a lot out there that we still need to research and to question and to learn just from.
Yeah, thank you. And then Virginia, I also know that you are working a lot in researching how we can provide voices to the vegetable domain, for example. So what can we learn from them?
Yes, we're just starting. I'm totally ignorant about that, but I'm very curious, and I feel that's something very relevant there. And with my colleague Francesca Vergani, also from Politecnico, we are just starting a conversation with an ethnobotanist, just to understand how to give, like voice to plants. And within this situated vocabulary of Nolo, we are imagining like to create a small vocabulary of plants, understanding how plants would say if they had a voice about a given neighborhood, like just to have this to the conversation, because of course it's important to add many voices, many human voices to a conversation, and to open up agonistic spaces for conversation, for democratic debate. But somehow it's interesting research, how can we also bring other voices that are also important, because we also interdepend with them. And even if we don't acknowledge it fully yet, most of the time, I believe. So how to bring those voices also into the conversation, and what does it mean to design really taking those voices into account? And I don't have an answer yet, but we are just at the very beginning of this experimentation.
Thank you. And Nick, what about building opportunities for dialogue and discourse among different stakeholders during the pandemic, and in these days as well? We always look at a public debate, which is something like frustrating, castrated maybe, just because as also Don Norman was mentioning before, maybe scientists are not in this good situation for opening a debate and for disseminating their knowledge and for letting people take part to this kind of knowledge. So how could we as designer support and elicit somehow this kind of dialogue?
It's indeed. I mean, it became tremendously obvious during this period. I like to say like that COVID-19 is almost like a contrast dye or contrast fluid for our society, and that it renders even more evident some of the cracks in our systems. And one of those is the way that we often fail to shape a debate, or I would say shape a debate early enough with those with the knowledge of certain developments, and those that would benefit from more knowledge of it, at least to a level that they would be able to deal with it in a better way. Speaking to a lot of people also recently, working, for example, in emergency services, etc., what they said is that with these complex challenges where all of a sudden, not just one society, but the whole globe, the whole world needs to face something, you really need everybody's input. You really need everybody's effort. And if at that moment you feel that you don't understand each other's language, that you don't understand each other's position, that you need too many words in order to explain, and you don't tap into the original ideas of perhaps somebody on the street that would make things work in a much faster way than some of the biggest experts in the room, then you fail as a whole. So I guess there you see it often, especially with now, of course, I think with COVID-19, there's also been a beautiful example of the humility of saying we don't know everything, and people have to accept that even from experts. Whereas then you see politicians saying, yes, but we need to make a statement, we need to do something, people rely on us to take action, so what do we do even if we don't know? So there are all these tensions, and being able to place like not just an argument but also a position taken or an action undertaken is something that requires also some I would say some basic knowledge about what's going on. So a lot of times when we deal with very future-oriented topics that we say, for example, take genetic testing. If you say we're going to end up in a society in which that is as commonplace as having your blood taken, everybody from the newborn or even before children are conceived, we go through procedural genetic testing. What would be the societal impact of that? If you do not start the public debate on issues like that before it arrives, and it's already there, you're going to have a very difficult discussion, because people come up with all kinds of arguments that might have something to do with it, might not have something to do with it in the factual sense, or might be misinterpretations, but you're going to have to deal with it. And you better open the discourse and nurture the public debate around these new things early enough, so that at the moment when you really need to have these discussions, people are ready. And I think when it comes to dealing with emergencies, very complex emergencies like this or others, it's a matter of involving more voices, as Virginia said, not from a hierarchical point of view, not from one discipline that's very, I mean, it's not because you're talking about a disease that it's only the medical or the biological or the virologist that should speak. We've seen that now, that not enough voices, for example, had been heard in elderly care, where a lot of problems were situated, at least here in Belgium, but also elsewhere. What about the homeless on the street? What about people in the tech industry that could provide solutions? How do you bring those people together? You're not going to do it in a moment of crisis. You're going to need to have something in place on beforehand.
Yeah. Thank you. And before you used a word which is humility, that resonates a lot to me, and it reminds me to Bruno Latour, who used to talk about designers as a humile Prometheus, and bringing the fire to society, but also being able to take part to the process, but then to leave the stage to the agency of people and of society as well. And referring this mythological reference to the evocative power of words makes me think about the fact that maybe design at a certain point sometimes is missing a sort of creative power. I mean, I would say that at the moment when design practice entered the academic community, somehow dealing with this kind of rules of the game made the languages of design weaker than before. What do you think about it?
Yes. Well, I was, while you were saying this, Francesca, I was thinking that sometimes what we miss is a bit of poetry. Like how language is used in poetry, the fact that you can, like keep contradictions together in poetry, you can suggest things without identifying them. And a lot of time it's required to us to identify things, to make use of a very identifying use of language. And somehow this forces, I think, the way in which we work as designers, because I don't think our DNA is made like that. So somehow, I think when we are forced to use a language that identifies, and as you say, like academic language, like these are the rules of the game, right? But somehow we throw away the baby with the bathwater, as they say in English. So we really miss a point. We really miss something important there. And I think we should dare sometimes to use language in a much more poetic way. And I think Nick is perhaps more free in this sense than I am. And that's how also the Neurological Institute came up, and how also his use of language also in his design fictions is much more free than I am. And there you probably see also that I'm more related to the academic work than he is. So perhaps there is a correlation indeed. But I think that space of freedom is something that we have to take for ourselves when we can.
Yeah, it's always a bit of an embarrassing moment when a student walks up to me and he asks, should I take a course in academic writing? Because my first answer would be, don't do it, because you're gonna lose so much of your expressive power if you try to conform too much. Of course, there's nothing wrong with trying to focus and being clear and building an argument. I mean, but that's decent writing in any case. But when it comes to a broader use of language, more of its expressive registers, I would say, there's so much we can learn from, as Virginia said, from poets, from writers. That's also why when we came up with the Neurological Institute, it was a kind of a tribute to Stanislav Lem, the Polish science fiction writer, because of the way that he used language in such a free way, creating all these funky new words that would immediately send your imagination flying. And that, I think, that's, as you mentioned, where the creative power lies. And as soon as you cut that out, just because somebody's going to stand up in the room and says, I don't get it, well, at least that's why we need to have a conversation. That's what sends us exploring. So clarity can also be an easy way out, or focus on efficiency, etc. It could also be a way out, or an escape route, a shortcut that just shouldn't be there in order to evade the real complexity. If you want to do justice to a complexity, you need to face it full on, and not just by some weird shortcut.
But also, this is something you see in philosophy, I think, because in philosophy you have really the same. Like on the one side, you want to be exact, you want to be, like you need to be thorough. But on the other side, you can say much more if you make a poetic use of language. And I think, like Nietzsche, for instance, it's an amazing example of how can you be a philosopher and poet together. And I think this is a huge inspiration for me, like how to, keep the balance between things. And at the end of the day, balance is never stable. So we are just always looking for it.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I would love to go ahead all night long. So maybe we could meet each other on another chat, having a whiskey and chocolate together. But then thank you so much, and good night.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Francesca.
And then we have to leave the floor to my colleague Silvia Gramegna for the next talk. Ciao, Silvia.
Bye. Good evening. Bye-bye.